Good morning, everyone. We're very pleased to have with us, appearing by a video conference from Baghdad, Nikolai Mladenov, the Secretary General, Special Representative for Iraq. Mr. Mladenov, I believe you'll make some comments, and then we can turn it over to the questioners here from New York. But please, if you can hear us, we're very pleased to have you, and you're free to start with your own remarks.
Thank you very much, and thank you for showing a consistent interest in the situation here in Iraq, which continues to be quite dramatic, and at some extent actually also very murky, because the security and the political landscape has not settled down since the fall of Mosul. Allow me in the beginning to make some comments on the security developments, briefly on the political developments, the humanitarian situation, and the human rights situation, and then I will be happy to take questions. I have to begin where it all started. Since the fall of Mosul, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, ISIL, has taken control over large swaths of Iraq's predominantly Sunni provinces, Nineveh, Salah ad-Din, Diyala, and some parts of Anbar that was already under the hands of ISIL are now out of the control of the government. Large cities including Mosul, Tikrit, Tal Afar, Beiji, Sinjar, and a number of other places, including Fallujah and Saklawiya and most of Ramadi, have also fallen under the control of the armed opposition groups. In the areas that are controlled by ISIL, we are witnessing the implementation of Sharia law. However, the enforcement of that law varies from place to place. We have seen a number of reports of summary mass executions of Shia members of the Iraqi army and displacement of Shia and minority civilians. Summary executions have been also targeting prisoners, mainly in Diyala province. In addition to this, we have seen the Kurdish regional government deploying Peshmerga troops into areas that are considered to be disputed, including some army bases, and they are now fully in control of the city of Kirkuk. The Iraqi army has been under severe criticism for abandoning its posts and weapons, and this criticism has been universal across the board, and some political leaders have vowed even to take prosecute these crimes to the full extent of the law. On June 11th, Prime Minister Maliki called for volunteers to fight alongside with the armed forces, and a couple of days afterwards, Grand Ayatollah Ali Sistani issued a fatwa calling for volunteers to also fight ISIL. His call was aimed at people joining the armed forces, being trained and integrated into the armed forces before fighting the terrorist groups. However, we have also witnessed the formation and the mobilization of various militias willing to take on ISIL, and some various reports of their numbers. This has, however, raised some concerns as to the sectarianization of this conflict since its beginning. Regionally, as you, I'm sure, well aware, this conflict could become quite easily a sectarian war between neighbors that have taken up quite firm positions as to what is happening here in Iraq. That danger has not been overcome at this point. On the political front, on June 12th, the Council of Representatives failed to vote on the Prime Minister's request to impose a state of emergency. The failure was because of a lack of quorum. 2 days later, on June 14th, the current parliament's term in Iraq expired, and that obviously risked creating a political vacuum. One of our top priorities since then has been to ensure that the Federal Supreme Court certifies the election results and that the newly elected parliament meets as soon as possible. Results were certified on June 16th, and we now expect that on July 1st, the newly elected parliament will meet and will begin the process of electing a new speaker, president, government formation, and obviously discuss the situation that has emerged since the fall of Mosul. Since then, 2 meetings have been held of the political leaders in the country. They have collectively sent messages to the public on the need for unity. These meetings have been, we consider these meetings to have been quite important elements in keeping the political process alive. And we expect that they will also influence a more positive momentum for the new Council of Representatives once it meets in a couple of days. UNAMI's focus has been on keeping the political process in Iraq alive and keeping and revitalizing it with the impending meeting of the new of the new parliament. We have consistently urged for the need for national dialogue, for unity, and very importantly, for the full participation of the Sunni community in the political process, without whom that process in itself would not be complete. Similar messages have been sent out to the regional countries and neighbors of Iraq, and as recently as 2 days ago, I was in Luxembourg briefing the EU foreign ministers. Before that, I met with the League of Arab States in Jeddah on the margins of the organization of the Islamic Conference foreign ministers meeting. Let me make 4 points on the political situation. Firstly, the part of the crisis that has been caused by the advances of ISIL must be addressed militarily. The success of any military operation hinges on at least 3 factors. Firstly, the cooperation between Baghdad and Erbil. Secondly, it must be based on an Iraqi-led plan. And third, and very important, it must reflect a certain level of national agreement or consensus between the various communities, because the threat that is posed by ISIL affects every community in this country. Secondly, a military solution alone would not be possible. It demands a political and a social package that addresses the concerns of all communities and is based, again, on broad agreement. There are a number of demands that the Sunni community have put forward over the last few months that need to be addressed through the political process. There's a continuing impasse with the Kurdish regional government over budgetary issues, oil and gas revenue sharing, salaries have not been paid, etc. These issues also need to be addressed rather quickly. Last but not least, there are outstanding issues, particularly related to poverty among some communities within the Shia part of the country, and their grievances need to be addressed as well. Third point, it is vital to stick to the constitutional framework and the democratic political process. Iraq has a newly elected parliament. Elections took place on April 30th, and over 60% of the population turned out to vote. This parliament must meet very soon, hopefully on the 1st of July, and a new government formation process must therefore begin promptly. Last point, regional and international engagement is important. Iraq should not be left alone to try and solve this crisis, as the crisis in itself is today in Iraq, but it has regional implications that go well beyond its borders. The humanitarian situation continues to be very dramatic. Today, Iraq is contending to be one of the largest countries hosting the largest number of internally displaced people. Over 1 million people have been displaced since January in this country. In addition to that, we have about another 1 million people displaced from various previous conflicts, 220,000 of whom are Syrian refugees. The government's capacity, both at the central level and at the regional level, to mount an effective response is completely stretched, and the UN has been called to assist on a number of occasions. We have relocated some of our staff to Erbil to be able to handle the biggest influx of displaced people that is happening now in the north of the country. However, the needs are growing in other parts of the country as well. Needs vary: shelter, non-food items, food, water, and health items continue to be very important. There is a clear evidence that some of the people that have been displaced by the conflicts are increasingly facing a challenge in getting food. Many of them are dropping down to 1 meal a day, which is a serious concern for all of us. The general population across the country is also affected by The conflict has shortages of fuel and consequent problems with electricity supply and water are now emerging. Obviously, there are a number of other risks. The UN's approach in dealing with the humanitarian crisis in an environment that is increasingly sectarian becomes very vital. Our assistance continues to be provided in an impartial manner to all. We monitor the human rights situation intensely. I will speak to that in a second. And we adhere, obviously, to the appropriate standards and the quality of the provision of assistance across the board. On human rights, and I will close with this, our Human Rights Office is monitoring the situation to the best of its ability, as all sides of this conflict have already undertaken various violations. We need to continue monitoring that, again, very closely. To date, UNAMI has been able to interview 125 individuals whose families have fled the fighting and are now in Dohuk and in Erbil. This is just the beginning of our monitoring effort, through which we hope to understand better what are the consequences from a human rights perspective of this conflict. Obviously, assessing civilian casualty numbers remains very difficult, as the areas that are most affected are difficult or impossible to access. But we believe that since the 5th of June, at least 900 civilians have been killed and 650 have been wounded in fighting in Nineveh, Salahuddin, and Diyala. These are our updated figures as of today. For Iraq in total, at least 1,300 have been killed and at least 1,250 have been wounded, including those in Nineveh, Salahuddin, and Diyala. Both the Iraqi security forces and ISIL have been accused of carrying out executions. UNAMI has verified incidents of ISIL executing captured police officers, soldiers, and civilians. We have also received a number of reports of abductions by ISIL of members of different religious and ethnic groups, such as the Shabaks, the Yazidi, and the Turkoman. In fact, that is an increasingly important concern for us, as the minority groups fall right in the pathway of the conflict in the north of this country. And at least 2 cases we have confirmed reports of summary executions of prisoners by the Iraqi army, one of which was in Talafa, allegedly involving the killing of 31 detainees. However, this one particular one has not been fully verified. Additionally, we have reports of abductions that have taken place in Baghdad and Iraq and across the country. 30 bodies have been found by the Iraqi police here just in Baghdad, all males, and they appear to have been executed. I want to use this opportunity again to urge the Iraqi authorities to swiftly carry out their obligations to thoroughly investigate these and any other reported summary executions and all other violations, and to make a concerted effort to bring the perpetrators to justice. UNAMI has received a number of reports of rape taking place in the city of Mosul just after the initial takeover of ISIL. And as we all see, there are numerous videos on the internet that have been uploaded by people that show beheadings and executions. We are working on preparing a separate report on the human rights situation and the implications of this conflict. Once that is ready, we will obviously share that with the media. And then very much at the end, let me highlight our most immediate concern from a humanitarian perspective. The UN continues to implement its humanitarian efforts in this conflict to the best of our ability. However, our situation remains dire. Our resources are overly stretched since the beginning of the year, and I want to use this opportunity again to appeal to the international community to support our efforts in providing UNAMI and the UN country team here with the necessary financial and other resources so that we can continue our work. Of the 105 million that we requested at the beginning of the year to deal with the Anbar crisis, only 24 million have been secured to date. With the new displacements, the caseload has doubled, and we anticipate a funding envelope of over 300 million to meet the most critical needs in areas where we can access refugees and IDPs at this point. Thank you very much, and I'm sorry this was a longer presentation, but I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mr. Mladinov. That was a very informative briefing, and we'll now open the floor to questions from here. When you're called upon, please identify yourself so he knows who's talking. Pam, first.
Mr. Mladinov, thank you for the briefing on behalf of the UN Correspondents Association, and I'm Pamela Falk from CBS News. On a political front, you mentioned that you call upon the government. Do you have a sense that there could be an inclusive government that includes Kurds and Sunnis and Shia by July 1? And on a military front, have you been in touch with any of the foreign forces, including U.S. Special Forces, who have arrived in the country? And where are the UN staff other than Erbil that you mentioned? Thank you.
Thank you very much for those questions. There will not be a government by July 1st, most certainly. On July 1st, Parliament should meet and begin the process of government formation. We hope that as soon as Parliament convenes, a speaker will be elected. That is the first step that needs to take place. Once that happens, Parliament should elect the President and the Vice President of the country. And then the Speaker of Parliament should ask the largest group in the Parliament to propose a government. These are the constitutionally mandated steps within the Iraqi political process. So we hope that they will unfold quickly after July 1st. Let me say that the key element of this process at this point remains the election of the next Speaker of the Iraqi Council of Representatives. For that to happen, there needs to be agreement among the political groups, and we're working intensely with representatives of all political parties to make sure that that is actually happening. On your question as to whether the next government would be inclusive, there is general agreement across the board that the next government must include substantial representation of all Iraq's communities, and it must be led by a team of people that are able to quickly address the challenges the country faces, as well as bring the various communities together. Now, what that composition, or the composition of that government will be, it is up to the democratically elected representatives of this country to decide. What our role is to ensure that the process and the constitutional provisions are met in due course. And on your second question, as far as armed groups and U.S. military advisors, no, we have not been in touch with any U.S. military advisors on the ground. And honestly, I don't think that's really our role in this situation. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Lou Charbonneau, Reuters. Two questions. There have been reports of the Syrian government bombing ISIL units along the border with Iraq. Do you know whether this is actually happening? And if so, has it had an impact on the situation there? And then secondly, you said that it's very important for other countries in the region to help Iraq. Iran has been offering its help and is a key player in the region. It's met a kind of lukewarm response, though there have been talks with the United States on it. Do you have the sense that Iran is able to help out? Are they doing so, and would you welcome that? Thanks.
Thank you very much. Let me just, I forgot to answer one question from Pamela as to our staff. our staff in Iraq is both in Baghdad, Erbil, and Basra, where we retain our offices. We also retain a small presence in Kirkuk, but a large number of our colleagues have been moved to Erbil to assist in the humanitarian effort. Previously, they were in Baghdad. On your questions as far as the border bombings, we have also seen the reports that bombing did take place. And what we understand is that these were not Iraqi jets. However, we have no more information than that. I do not believe that it has had any substantial impact on the situation on the ground. As far as assistance from the neighbors, any assistance to Iraq must be based on a request by the Iraqi government, and it must be in line with the international commitments and the bilateral agreements that this country has with its allies. There is a role for the region. It is important that the region and Iraq's neighbors collectively understand that the threat that the country faces today with ISIL is a threat that goes beyond the borders of this country. Therefore, cooperation on preventing the expansion of this threat, reducing the opportunities for financing or supporting of terrorism in line with UN Security Council resolutions is a first step. I understand and I know very well that there are many complicated differences between the neighbors of Iraq on a whole array of issues. However, I do also believe that it's important for everyone to acknowledge that dealing with the threat that this country faces today from a security perspective should be an imperative for everyone. However, on the specific forms of assistance that Iraq receives, I would prefer that that be handled by the Iraqi government, again, in line with its constitution, its international commitments, its bilateral arrangements. And anyone who wants to help Iraq should first consult with the Iraqi authorities. Thank you.
Edie?
Thank you, Mr. Mladenov. It's Edith Lederer from the Associated Press. I have two questions. First, what is your assessment of the advancement of ISIL toward Baghdad? Are they making headway? Is there a possibility that they could attack the capital and possibly take it over? And secondly, you said that this conflict could quite easily become a sectarian war. What, in your view, could actually push it from the point it is now into a sectarian war? Thank you.
Thank you, Edith. On the military front, we believe that the advancement of ISIL towards Baghdad has stalled. At this point, the city is well saturated with Iraqi security forces. Now, I would not want to speculate as to whether it can or cannot be taken over. However, I believe that for anyone to attempt to take over Baghdad would be an extremely difficult enterprise. On your questions related to the sectarian risks in this conflict, since the first days after the fall of Mosul and the advancement of ISIL to the south, our primary concern was that if the armed opposition groups were to reach the city of Samarra and affect the Shia holy shrines, this would immediately spark a wide sectarian conflict in the country and possibly beyond. Clearly, that did not happen. There are many reasons why this was not the case. Indeed, Samarra is also quite well protected currently. This would be the type of event that can create a sectarian conflict. Let me just remind everyone that since the emergence of this group in Iraq, it has been quite clever at exploring the divisions that exist within Iraqi society, whether they're at a religious or an ethnic level. Over the last few months, if not years, we have seen terrorists attack both Shia shrines and Sunni mosques. They have targeted elected officials across the board with the clear aim to make parts of the country ungovernable and to be able to take control of those areas. Therefore, the risk of a further sectarianization of the conflict remains. However, I think the more that the international community is aware of that risk, the more that risk is mitigated. We have also seen a number of statements by senior religious authorities on the Shia side, but as well as on the Sunni side, that have called for moderation and in order to reduce this risk. Thank you very much.
Maggie?
Mr. Mladenov, it's Margaret Bashir with Voice of America. You said Samarra is safe for now, but what about like the Shiite heartland in Najaf and Basra? Has there been any evidence of ISIL trying to go around Baghdad and heading straight for the south? And also there was a report today in the American press about Iran sending drones into Iraq. Have you any information about this?
Thank you very much for those questions. The south of the country has not seen any particular change in the levels of violence before the fall of Mosul. However, it is quite clear that the strategy of the armed opposition groups is to try and isolate Baghdad. In this strategy, they will face the stiff opposition of the south of the country, as well as the concentration of forces that Baghdad has seen since the beginning of this conflict. On your second question, the UN and UNAMI have no capability to confirm or to monitor the presence of drones in this country.
Okay, Matthew?
Matthew Lee, Intercity Press, on behalf of the Free UN Coalition for Access. Thanks for the briefing. I wanted to know about your contacts with Kurdistan. Seems like people are saying that that it's a new situation, that there seems to be a lot of demands up there for actual full independence. And I wanted to know, one, what you think of that, but two, if when the last time you spoke with Mr. Barzani, and also I wanted to know about the Balad Air Base. There's some talk of the ISIS or ISIL surrounding it on three sides, and that they may take over an air base and therefore have an air force. What do you think is in the base, and if they got inside, could they actually have an air force? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for those questions. We're constantly in touch with the KRG leadership. I saw some of them just before flying out to Luxembourg a couple of days ago. Yes, there's been a lot of emotional talk over the last few days. It reflects a heightened anxiety, both in Baghdad and in Erbil, that has been rising over the last few months. Baghdad and Erbil have drifted apart on a number of issues. The budget of Iraq remains unapproved because of a dispute between the federal and the regional capital. We continue to face the situation in which, because of a lack of a budget, the government in Baghdad refuses to provide the subsidy that is necessary to the KRG. All of this has increased the tensions between both Erbil and Baghdad. However, I think at this point, there's a growing realization, both here and in Kurdistan, that cooperation needs to be restored as far as the security threat that ISIL presents for the entire country. And that is quite visible also on the ground. Since the fall of Mosul, there's been an impromptu cooperation between the Peshmerga and the Iraqi security forces. It has caused some incidents in some areas that have had to be mitigated by dialogue between Baghdad and Erbil. And we have seen an increasing number of incidents in which the Peshmerga and ISIL have clashed in different parts of the country. Obviously, that also increases tensions within the KRG and the understanding that the threat needs to be handled jointly. This is why, in the beginning, I said that for any security plan to work, it hinges on the cooperation between the federal and the regional authorities. Last point on this, since the fall of Mosul, the Peshmerga have moved in to secure parts of the disputed areas. That has been done with the tacit agreement with the Iraqi security forces. Obviously, it hasn't gone without any trouble in its entirety. However, in the areas that they are under the control of the Peshmerga, the situation remains, at this point, more or less quiet. Your question as to the Balad air base, our reports from there are that clashes are continuing, but it is by far not under the control of the armed opposition groups. It remains under government control. It is an important air base for the Iraqi security forces, and I'm sure that they will invest as much as necessary to protect it. Thank you.
Jonathan?
Hi, Jonathan Wachtel with Fox News. Thank you for the briefing, Mr. Mladenov. You mentioned that if there's going to be international cooperation in trying to resolve this crisis, you're pushing for that to be processed through official, federal, and regional Iraqi systems. But isn't the crisis so grave now and the threat so grave that there may not be time for that type of process? And then I have a second question about Kurdistan, and should they push to become independent, what is the UN's position on that, and what would be the ramifications of such a move?
Thank you, Jonathan. The situation is grave, but it is solvable. It is not impossible to save Iraq, and it demands both a security operation, but it also demands a political process. This is why we keep going back to the question of the constitutional framework that exists in this country. Iraq has just gone through an election. There's a newly elected parliament that needs to put in place the key components for the future of this country, the presidency, the government, etc. So I firmly believe that if we stick to the constitutional process, if we meet the constitutional deadlines, if all political parties engage constructively in the process of government formation, putting their differences aside and very much understanding that it is not business as usual anymore, when large parts of the country are controlled by an armed opposition groups and beyond the reach of the government, it is not business as usual by far. So through that process, it needs to be addressed. Therefore, any international assistance or cooperation with Iraq must continue to come through the official channels of government. Any other attempt would not be helpful by far. On your question as for the KRG, I'm really not in the business of speculating what will happen in the future, particularly when we have such an important and difficult crisis to resolve as we speak. At this point, it is imperative that KRG government cooperate on the security front, and later, as a new Iraqi government is formed, with the participation of all the communities, the various outstanding issues begin to be addressed. It is clear that this country continues to suffer the effect of leaving too many open wounds from the past, as well as unresolved constitutional questions. The elements of the constitutional setup of Iraq have not been finalized. Revenue sharing law, Federation Council, the hydrocarbons law, These are elements that are required by the Iraqi constitution, and they have not been finalized, and they've always been postponed. I firmly believe that once the dust settles on this conflict now, and the country begins, hopefully in the future, to come together and to move forward, it will be imperative to resolve these open issues, and that would obviously help bring the communities together and prevent such risks as we're seeing now down the line again. Thank you very much.
Sangwan?
Sir, the beginning of your statement, we couldn't quite hear you because there was an audio drop. You were saying what exactly in terms of facing the grave situation, in terms of the threat right now, the imminent threat? You feel that things can sustain themselves enough time to allow a political resolution of the crisis, or is the situation so grave that actually perhaps even military intervention would have to come from outside?
The situation is grave. However, it cannot be resolved only through military means. It can be resolved, however, through the political process. That includes sticking to the constitutional timetable here in Iraq, going through the motions that are necessary of electing a new speaker, electing a new president, electing a government, etc. In addition to which, you obviously need a security operation to deal with the security threat that ISIL poses. But as I said in the beginning, the situation is grave, but Iraq can be saved, and the country can be brought together if political leaders understand that it is no longer business as usual, that they need to reach across the ethnic and the religious and the sectarian and various other divides that exist in this country, address the immediate security threat today, focus on the political concerns that various communities in Iraq have, Sunni, Shia, Kurdish, etc., stick to the constitutional timeline and the process, and go back to dealing with the outstanding issues from the unfinished business of the Constitution. Thank you.
Sangwan?
Hello, Sangwan from Bloomberg News. I have three questions. You said ISIL's advance towards Baghdad has stalled for now. What do you see is the biggest reason for that stalling? And do you think U.S. deployment of military advisors has helped? And what has the impact of that been? Secondly, in terms of stopping the financing of ISIL by, be it regional partners or foreign countries, et cetera, aside from the calls that the UN has already made, what do you suggest the Security Council can do to find ways to cut off that financing? And third, today President Maliki basically refused to step down and called any sort of moves or urges for him to stand down as a coup. Are you confident that he, as a leader, can help bring this unity that you've been talking about? Thank you.
Thank you very much. There are many reasons for the stall of the advance. Obviously, Baghdad is a city in which we have seen the massing of quite a large number of ISF forces. The morale of the army has been somewhat lifted by the fact that new recruits have joined the ranks of the Iraqi forces. The threat to religious sites has galvanized support, particularly among the Shia community, to protect these sites. So there are complex reasons why this has happened. On financing, the UN Security Council has at least two resolutions relating to Al-Qaeda and the financing of terrorist organizations. What I hope we can all collectively ensure that these resolutions are abided by all members of the international community. That would obviously be very important. However, let us also understand that groups like ISIL have various sources of finance, and some of them have are quite criminal in nature. Racketeering, basically, in areas where they are present, including Mosul before these events, has been observed on quite a few occasions. Obviously, taking control of banking facilities in Mosul has filled in some of the coffers, as well as controlling some oil fields in the north, in Iraq, and mostly in Syria. And on your last question on Prime Minister Maliki's statement today, look, I do not know who will be the next Prime Minister of Iraq or who will be in the next government. It is up to the Iraqi political leaders to decide that. What I do know, however, is that the next government needs to include representation of all of Iraq's communities, and it must focus on a program that is actually bringing the country together. How the voting in parliament will work, what will be the exact composition of the majority for that government really is up to the democratically elected leaders of this country. If we were to step away from the current constitutional process, we would be creating risks for the country that would be quite unpredictable. And the current political process, again, has a very clear time frame and a very clear time framework. 1st of July, Parliament meets. It begins with the election of Speaker, Presidency, government formation process, etc. We're talking of a very short period of time. This is what the Constitution provides, and it's necessary to stick to that process because that would help, obviously, the country move forward.
Okay. There's still quite a lot of hands up, so I'll try to fit as many of you in, but if you can keep it then to one question, and I'll try to get as many of you in as possible. Sherwin?
Mr. Mladenov, thank you. Sherwin Bryce, South African Broadcasting. You talk about the morale being lifted in the army, but morale, you'll agree, won't win battles and wars. What is the competency of the Iraqi military? And to Sangwan's earlier question, what has been the mood regarding the return of those 300 U.S. military advisors to Iraq among Iraqis themselves?
Let me start with your second question. Our understanding is that this assistance is welcome, and it comes at the request of the Iraqi authorities. On your question regarding the morale of the army and its competency, the Iraqi armed forces have been overstretched for many years now across the country. Since January, a bitter battle has been happening in the province of Anbar. So there were many reasons why the situation in the north developed as it did. However, the command structure of the armed forces in the south of the country remains intact. And if the leadership of the Iraqi security forces are able to formulate a clear plan that provides for more or less consensus or wide national approval of how they deal with the situation, if they receive the support from the public in implementing it, if they're able to understand that it should focus on dealing with the security threat that Daesh poses, that ISIL poses, and that they stand every chance of restoring security back to their country. One idea that has been widely debated in Iraq and remains very much on the agenda is to increase the recruitment from areas like Mosul and the Nineveh province, where not everybody agrees with the fact that obviously ISIL has taken over. And getting recruits from there would be important to increase the effectiveness of future operations in the north. Thank you.
Evelyn?
Thank you. Evelyn Leopold, contributor to Huffington Post. Can we talk about money a bit more, the financing, as Sangwan brought up? Oil's power and money. The militants claim they control a key oil field, and the Kurds in Kirkuk another. Who is getting all the funds? And how does this affect the central government? And how much, there are different figures of how much was looted from the central bank in Mosul. Any information you have would be appreciated. Thank you.
Our assessment is that over 400, perhaps 450 million were looted from the bank in Mosul. But again, this is an assessment based mostly on second-hand information that we have. On the control of the oil fields, the largest refinery in Iraq at the city of Beji continues to be disputed. The government forces still remain in control of the refinery itself. However, fighting is continuing. And on the broader question of oil, Iraq's oil fields in the south of the country, which are the vast majority of the reserves that are currently used here in Iraq, remain safe. And in areas that are under the control of the central government. So operation there should be normal. There is a continuing dispute between the federal government and the Kurdistan regional government as to the rights of export of oil that is drilled in the north. However, I believe that the urgency of the situation now demands that we focus on the broader problem that we face in terms of the security than trying to address this particular case on a short-term basis. It actually can be addressed if there is a coherent debate on revenue sharing and hydrocarbons law, two issues, again, that go back to the Iraqi constitution. And I'm sincerely hopeful that they will be dealt with by the next parliament if the next parliament really sincerely attempts to bring the country back together and restore the cooperation and the coexistence of the various groups in this country. Thank you.
Yeah.
Nizar?
Thank you, Mr. Mladinov. Nizar Aboud from Al Mayadeen Television in Beirut. My question is regarding the Turks who have been abducted in Iraq. There has been almost 80 of them. Some of them are diplomats and special forces. Has there been any attempt to release these or to make a deal in order to free them? Another thing about the flow of support to ISIS. We see through the social media there's a lot of support in the Gulf states to them. And there were, of course, some accusations that certain countries in the region have been providing them with finances and logistical aid. What do you know about this, and if you can shed some light on it?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear your second question about ISIL. Can you repeat that?
Yeah, my second question is regarding the support from some Gulf states to ISIL, as it has been accused by Mr. Maliki himself and others, and the flow of finance and vehicles sometimes, and artillery and other equipment. What do you know about that? Are you able to verify any of that? Has the government came forward with any evidence to support their allegations? We know in Kuwait that there was a senior Kuwaiti who was deposed from his position as minister because of providing support to such groups. What do you know about that?
Thank you for those questions. Firstly, we continue to receive reports of abductions in the north of the country. It is not just the case that you were citing of the 48 Turkish citizens that were abducted from the consulate in Mosul. There were at least 40 Indian national workers. This was information provided by the Indian Foreign Ministry. We have reports of other nationalities that have been taken by ISIL. Of course, in some cases, they have been released. In most of these cases, including the case of Turkey, the Turkish government has not looked to the United Nations or to UNAMI for assistance in resolving the problem. So any questions related to that, I would actually focus more on the Turkish authorities. In terms of the financing and the flow of vehicles and weapons that ISIL possesses, clearly the organization is quite well funded. There's no question about that. And clearly it has different sources for its revenues. Some external, some in the north of Iraq, the money that they seized, the racketeering that they were involved in a number of occasions. Obviously, some of their sources are also across the board in Syria. What we can confirm is that the people that came across the border from Syria were well trained, well equipped, and clearly very well prepared. And quite a number of them were from across the region, and very few were actually Iraqi, if any at all. So the organization has capabilities. I would hasten to point fingers as to who and how provides their financing. However, I would again repeat the call that the UN always makes, and that is for all countries to abide by the relevant Security Council resolutions related to the financing and support of terrorism, particularly related to Al-Qaeda and ISIL. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. Last question in the back.
Thank you. I'm Celia Mendoza from Voice of America Latin American Service. And you mentioned 1 million people were displaced and is expected to see that number grow rapidly. How is being handled on the ground? And in terms of the resources, what's available to help all these people? You mentioned many of them fled from Syria and they have their own problem and now is going into Iraq and is growing. Is it fear? We have a lot of children. Do you know the number of children or the percentage that is children in that group? And is any fear that these people may end up being forced to join ISIL, that they become part of ISIL by force, that they end up being used as bombers or anything like that?
Thank you very much for those questions. We need to differentiate that very broadly speaking, there are at least four groups that we have to identify. Firstly, there are people who have been displaced by the previous conflicts in Iraq that go back to over almost a decade ago. Secondly, there is a group of about 220,000 Syrian refugees, most of whom are in the Kurdish provinces of the country. Overwhelmingly, they're in the Kurdish provinces of the country. The next group is the third group is people who have been displaced by the conflict in Anbar since the beginning of the year. Some of them have moved into other provinces of Iraq. Some are stuck in the province of Anbar, but not where the families, where they live, where their homes are. But they have been unable to leave because of the fighting. And the last group today, perhaps the biggest group, are those who have been displaced by the fall of Mosul and the events that followed since the beginning of that part of the conflict. These, we believe, are about 500,000 at this point, at least 500,000. Now, within that group, obviously, there are, again, different groups that need to be differentiated. Some people fled Mosul as ISIL advanced. Most of them moved immediately to the closest areas where they considered to be safe, Erbil and Dokkum. Some have been allowed to cross into the provinces and are hosted with their families and friends. Others are in temporary facilities. At least one temporary facility has emerged to host quite a number of families at this point. Just outside of Erbil, there are two more emerging out of in the province of Dohuk. Then you have people who were displaced by the fall of the city of Tal Afar. And I focus on them because they are an ethnic and religious minority in Iraq. They are Turkoman, and some of them are Shia. They have also been displaced quite, radically overnight after the fall of that city. Now we're also seeing people from the province of Diyala, which is to the west of the country, that are fleeing the fighting to the north, and that is an emerging trend as well. Needs vary, but the needs, if I had to summarize, would be that they are the life-saving, most urgent needs at this point: providing shelter, providing water, providing food, and providing health care. These are the immediate needs that we are struggling, and I underline the word struggling, to meet with very limited resources and across the country. In some cases, it has been very difficult, if not impossible, for us to reach displaced people. Some from Tal Afar went into the area of Sinjar. We have not been able to get to them because of the security situation on the ground. Your question as to children, our assessment is still ongoing. Our child care advisor was up in the north until just a couple of days ago. Part of our human rights monitoring is focusing on looking at the situation of children and people that have been displaced. But overall, what I can say that within the 1 million internally displaced people in Iraq, every family has on an average between 3 to 5 kids. So there are quite a lot of kids out there that need assistance, and the various UN agencies are working very intensely to try and get that assistance to them, whether it's UNICEF trying to help with schooling, WFP trying to help with food, or the activities that UNHCR are undertaking. So we're very much aware of this particular need, and we will continue to monitor it and to provide our assistance as possible. But once again, let me highlight again the difficult financial constraints that the UN faces in dealing with this situation. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Mr. Mladenov, for that very informative briefing and for spending so much time taking everyone's questions. And we wish you and your colleagues the best of luck in the days ahead. Thanks a lot.